Hey everybody, thanks for coming to this next session. Really excited to introduce our next speaker. How many people are building apps or want to build apps? Yeah, great. So for me, building an app is great, but I can never get it to look great. And so Lucy's going to come up and tell us about how to do that. So Lucy?
Hi everyone, thanks Ralph for that lovely introduction. As Ralph said, I'm a UX designer on our ecosystem team at Atlassian. So my primary role is working with our marketplace vendors, people who build apps for our product and sell them on our marketplace. But today I'm going to be talking about customizations and customizing our Atlassian products. So I saw just then that quite a few of you, almost everyone, is currently building or thinking about building some customizations for the product, which is awesome because today I'm going to be talking about how to design your customizations and make them fit into your users' workflows. Now, that sounds like design work. Who here is a UX designer? Show of hands. 1, 2, 2 people out of all of these people. I expected this. If you were all UX designers, my presentation wouldn't really work out today, so it's okay, not many of you are designers. So I assume when you're building these customizations for our products, you don't want to spend a long time understanding our Atlassian design guidelines, the product mental models, and design patterns. That's okay because today I'm going to show you a way around this. Sounds like a fun time for me, but I understand that people have other jobs to do. So as I mentioned, I work in our ecosystem team and I work with a lot of people who are customizing the products. And it might surprise you to know that a lot of people are customizing the products in the same way or in similar ways. So today what I'm going to do is share these use cases for how people are customizing the products. And hopefully these use cases might tackle some of the problems that you're facing, or they might give you some inspiration for how you can customize the products yourself. So you don't need a designer starter pack, you don't need to be a designer, you don't need to reinvent the wheel over and over again. There are some things that we can learn from other people. So I'm going to be starting off with JIRA, and then I'm going to talk through Confluence. And I'm going to share the most common ways that people are customizing the products. So it's by no means everything you can do with the products from a technical point of view. If I went through that, we'd be here all day because you can do a lot with the products. But these are just the top, most common ways that people are customizing them. So at the end, I want to talk a little bit about what you can do if I haven't shared something that's going to work for your use case today, but you still want to ensure good design practices. Now, these design patterns will, for the most part, work for server and cloud, but keep in mind that from an implementation perspective, they are very different. If you have questions about the technical side of things, I'm not the best person to answer them, but if you stick around, I can help you get in touch with our developer relations team. Ralph is on that team. I work very closely with them, and they can definitely help you out with that. So before I jump straight into it, I just wanted to take a moment to talk about why you should care about the design of your customizations. We all know, I'm sure, that user experience design isn't about making something pretty, it's about making something useful. But people still say to me, well, if it's an internal-only customization, why should I care about the design? Now, if you are building a customization that is for you and you only to use and it doesn't affect any other person, by all means, go nuts, do whatever works for you. But I assume that most of you are building these customizations for some kind of user base, whether that's your team or your company, maybe it's your boss. You're probably building for a group of users. And these users, I assume, are familiar with Atlassian products, probably use them every day in their work life. And that means that they have some expectation of how the products work. They have some knowledge of how JIRA works, and they have some expectations. So if you break these expectations with your customizations, you're going to probably end up confusing your users. Now, if it's your team at work, you could probably explain it to them. But if it feels unnatural, it's going to be harder for them to recall and remember how to use it. And it will probably end up slowing them down. And I know that no one here wants to slow down their boss. So I just wanted to emphasize that you should consider thinking about the design of your customizations. And that is what we're going to talk about today. So hopefully I've convinced you all to listen to me for the next half hour. So I'm going to start off with JIRA. And for JIRA, most of the customizations happen on the issue view page. And by the issue view page, I mean this page right here. So I'm sure you're all familiar with this page. Now, there are two locations on this page that most people are customizing. The first one is over here on the right, and in the ecosystem design team, we call this the context panel. Now, what do I mean by context? Here is where you would surface any information that is relating to the issue. So this could be relevant pull requests, on-call rosters, maybe tests. Remember, for most people, a JIRA ticket is the source of truth for a task at any given point in time. So the idea is a user would be able to come to this page and get a holistic overview of all the work relating to this task. They can jump off from this panel to other products to get more context, and the content that you display here could be dynamic or static data. So from a technical perspective, you can really display anything in this panel. But I wanted to share some different variations that we use at Atlassian so that you can get an idea of how you could design it and keep it consistent for your users. Now, the type of customizations that generally use this extension point or this design pattern could be integrations, and by that I mean another product connecting to JIRA, or it could be a feature app, and by that I mean something extending JIRA's functionality. Moving on to the second design pattern for the JIRA issue view, which we in the design team call the content panel. It's here in the middle section, not to be confused with the context panel that I just talked about. And this is used to attach custom objects. So those could be test results, reports, diagrams, prototypes, videos, any object coming from another tool. You can use this to dynamically update those objects that you attach to a ticket. So if I create a prototype in my prototyping tool and then attach it to JIRA, the idea is that I could keep working on my prototype in my other tool and it will automatically update the object on the JIRA issue. As I said before, JIRA tickets are usually the source of truth for a task at any given moment. So you want to make sure the content on the ticket is up to date. This is usually used by integrations because it's a great way to bring in content from another application. As for the design, JIRA already has a concept for attachments, and it's really important that we follow this design pattern. You can imagine it would be pretty confusing if we had two different interaction patterns for attachments on this one page. So to do that, we have an empty state to begin with. This is what would be shown if you have no attachments there yet. And that would be some call to action to your user. So it could be something like browse files to attach. And this could link to the user's desktop or wherever they keep their files, or it could be used to open a dialog to browse files from another tool. Another thing that some of our people who build customizations do is to use a dialog to require input from the user here. So for some objects, you require a link to attach it to a JIRA ticket. So InVision uses this for their add-on. If you were creating a customization for Google Docs, for example, you could use the share link to attach it to a ticket. And a dialogue is a great way of getting that input from the user. Then you need to think about how you're going to render these objects on the ticket. This is the design pattern that JIRA uses. However, it's a little bit dependent on your specific use case. For example, if your objects are big text files, maybe it's not so useful to render an image preview of that tiny Word document. But if it's something like a prototype, perhaps you'd want to show a larger image preview. Whatever you decide to go with, try to follow something similar to what JIRA currently has so that your users can recognize that. To add to this pattern, something that I want to mention that I think is a really great idea is down here we have this activity section, and you can actually create your own tabs here. So if you are attaching objects that are dynamically updated from another tool, it's a great idea to create its own tab so that you can feed in that activity coming from the other tool. So if I was working on my prototype in my favorite prototyping tool, I would be able to see, and my colleagues would be able to see, a feed of updates from the ticket. So again, the ticket is the source of truth, and it would be great to see what activity has happened on that object, if there's any comments on the object that I need to go out and have a look at in another tool. Moving away from the issue view now, another common use case for customizing JIRA is by bringing in content or data that's very specific to your company or your team that needs to live in JIRA for some reason. So this can happen at the global level. You can create your own pages in JIRA. So this is the global level, or it can happen at the project level as well. And you can create your own pages here. So the first thing to think about if you're considering customizing JIRA in this way would be where in the product does your content belong? So to do this, we need to consider the hierarchy and the concepts in JIRA. Now, JIRA has three main hierarchical concepts, and those are the global level, which I just showed, and that would be all projects within a JIRA instance. Then we have the project level, which looks like this, and that would be all issues within a project. And then we have the issue level, which relates to individual tasks and users, which I'm going to come to in just a moment. As for design patterns, it's very hard for me to show a template for this because it is very dependent on what kind of data you're showing. But I did put together a little sample customization myself to show some of the common UI components that people use when using this customization. It's mostly used for reporting and admin tools. So here I have some statistics. I'm using our tabs and a table. And you can find these UI components in our design guidelines and our front-end libraries, which I'm going to talk about at the end. Now back to that individual or task level, you can also put panels on the dashboard. I'm sure you're all familiar with the dashboard. But here you can create content that could be specific to a user or a group of users or specific to a task. So an example would be I could have a panel here that shows me all open issues in a sprint, in this week's sprint, or all issues that are assigned to me, which we actually have right there. So those are the most common ways that people customize JIRA and some design patterns to go with them. Now I'm going to talk through Confluence. So the most common way that people customize Confluence is by creating macros. And I'm sure you've all used macros and you probably know what they are, but in case you don't, macros provide dynamic content to be displayed on a Confluence page. So an end user can input the macro while they're editing the page, and it will render some sort of content when the page is published. This is an example of the Glyphy for Confluence macro, which you can use to create diagrams on pages. So the types of customizations that generally use macros are integrations, so connecting other tools to Confluence. What we call specialized content, which would be if your company or your team needs to use special symbols or equations in your page, maybe particular diagrams. And we also have composed content apps, which take input from the user and render them in a certain way. So that could be roadmaps or charts or graphs. As for the design, now I'm sure this is probably very familiar, but when you're creating a macro or adding a macro to your page, you go into edit mode and click the plus button, and you can select other macros, which will bring up the macro browser. So for the design, you'll need to contribute a listing to the macro browser. And then when the user has selected your macro, they will go into the macro editor, and this is where they put all their input into the macro. And all of this happens inside a dialog inside Confluence. Now, this is, again, very dependent on what kind of data you're hoping to render with your macro, and you can do anything, technically speaking, in this dialog. But what we like to recommend, and what a lot of our app vendors use, is a pattern similar to this. So you can see we get the input from the user there on the left, and we have a section on the right to show a preview of what would be displayed on the page. And this is so the user has some expectation of what they're about to publish. So just to show an example, this is a screenshot of the profile picture macro we have in Confluence. You can see there on the left, I'm getting the user's name, and on the right, I'm displaying a preview of exactly what's going to be shown on the page. Another design pattern that I think works really well with macros is our file preview pattern, So when you publish the page with a macro, you can see here, if we hover over it, you can see this frame, and we can put actions in there. So edit is a great one for obvious reasons, but open in file preview or full screen is another one. So when the user clicks on this, it will look like this, which if you're a Confluence user, you're probably familiar with. And this allows the user to see the macro content much larger, so it's great for complicated diagrams and images, and they can add comments on the content, which is really great. Moving on to our next use case for Confluence, and in the design team, we call this blueprints. So we're all familiar with this create button. When we click that, we get this dialog where we select what type of page we want to create in Confluence. Now you can create a customization to create your own type of custom page. And this would give your end users some predefined template with temporary text that they can then go ahead and edit themselves. So this is great if your company has a specific page that they have to create often and you want to keep consistent, or you want to make sure your colleagues don't forget to add some content from their monthly reports, things like that. So when the user selects the blueprint from this dialog, they then go into the blueprint editor, which again, similar to the macro, happens in a dialog, and it's a series of input fields. And we use this to get some data from the user to then go and generate the blueprint. So at Atlassian, we use blueprints for things like roadmaps and retros, and I have an example here. We have these pages called DAISYs, which everyone loves. We use them to make decisions. It stands for Driver, Approver, Contributor, Informed. So you can see I have these input fields here to get a little bit of information from the user. We have the status of the decision, the driver, the approver, and the due date. And then on the side there, we have a little bit of context of what the page is about in case they're new. When we click Create, we land on the page in edit mode. And as you can see, it's very much a template. So there's a lot of different panels and tables in here, and there's a lot of guiding text informing the end user exactly what's required of them. Now, on to my last common use case for customizing Confluence, and I've split this into two. We have the More Actions drop-down menu, and you can customize the page byline. In the ecosystem design team, we refer to these as page extensions, but I want to walk through them one by one. So I'll start with the More Actions menu. Now, this customization is really super simple, but I think it is really valuable to users. If you have an action that relates to the context of a page, you can put it in this menu. So it could be something like export this page to a particular file type or approve this page. It gives users a really quick and easy way to close the loop on information that they've received here. And on to the byline. So if you see there under the header, I've installed two add-ons that use this customization. And this is usually used to show some sort of statistic or status about the page. So you can see the first one I have installed there is Kamala approvals, and 2 out of 5 of my colleagues have approved this page. When you click on the content, you can also render an inline dialog which can give more information on the status or whatever content you're displaying in the byline. And you can put actions in there as well. So I think for Kamala approvals, it shows you exactly which of your colleagues have approved the page and which ones you're waiting on. And I think there's an option there to poke them or send them an email. So those are all the design patterns and use cases that I have for JIRA and Confluence. Those are the top 3 most common ones for each of the products. I hope that that helps you addresses some of the use cases that you are tackling yourself. If not, I did want to take a moment to talk about some things that talk about some things that you can do to ensure good design practice and make sure you're not making these silly mistakes. Thank you. So for our app developers, people who publish apps on the marketplace, we do have a set of design principles that we ask them to follow. And I did pull out one of them because I think it is relevant to people creating internal customizations. So the principle is called Be Harmonious. And the first point of it is to keep it recognizable. And by that, I mean keep your customization looking and feeling the way that your users know JIRA or Confluence to look and feel. So you can refer to our Atlassian design guidelines or our front-end libraries, which I'm going to link to in just a moment, to see the colors that we use and what the colors mean to our users. You can see the buttons and the dialogues and the justification behind why we've designed them that way, and you can use our components for yourself. So this will help your users to recognize your customizations and make it feel as though it's a part of the product. So not creating that jarring experience. Something that you can do to ensure that your customization is working harmoniously is to check with your users. And I think that this is much easier in a way for people creating internal customizations as opposed to selling apps, because I assume you know who your users are, if it's your team or your company. So consider asking your colleagues, hey, if you were using a Confluence page, where would you expect this action to be? Or show them some early designs or prototypes of what you're planning and see if they have any feedback on it, see if they can understand it. That's a great way to do some quick guerrilla testing. And finally, when in doubt, follow similar patterns within the product. If something isn't documented in the Atlassian design guidelines that you need for your particular case, consider doing a little research into the products. I'm sure you're all very familiar with the products anyway. And have a look if there are any patterns that you can just copy and implement for your own customizations. It means less design work for you and a more consistent experience for your users. I wanted to show an example of someone who is not being harmonious, and I do have to say, I did make this up. I didn't want to shame anyone, but it does highlight some mistakes that people do really make. So this is an example of a screen recording add-on for JIRA. The idea behind it is that if you are raising a bug in JIRA, you might want to attach a recording of that bug's behavior so the person picking up the ticket can have a bit of context. But you can see here the primary action is to start a recording and the secondary action is to select a recording. But if we think about the workflow there, it's unlikely that the user would have found a bug, raised a ticket, then started a recording from JIRA, go back to reproduce the bug. It's more likely that they would start the recording when they found the bug and then create the ticket and attach a recording. So perhaps the workflow hasn't been so well thought through for this add-on. You can also see that this add-on doesn't follow Atlassian's visual design language very well. In fact, it creates quite a jarring visual experience. We also have to think about what a green button means to a JIRA user. When you're in the context of JIRA and you expect things to work the way you know how JIRA works, this might mean something different. An example I have for this was I was working with someone who was building a customization and integration between their product and JIRA. And their branding was all this yellowy orange color, and they used yellow buttons in their product. And for their JIRA app, they were using a yellow button as the primary action. But if you think about what a yellow button means for a JIRA user, we actually use them in JIRA Cloud to mean warning, or to warn users when they're about to perform some potentially destructive action, like deleting a JIRA project or deleting a user. So for a JIRA user, that actually causes some hesitation and has some negative connotations around it, which you don't want to use for your apps or your customizations. So as I mentioned, I have some resources that I want to share with all of you. Up the top there, we have the Cloud Design Guidelines. So this has all of our UI components, our buttons, our dialogues, lozenges, things that you can use when creating your own customizations. And then we have our front-end library to go along with that, which is called Atlas Kit. And you can find that at go.atlassian.com/ak. So you can take advantage of some of those components. Also in the design guidelines, we have things like our colors and what they mean, so you don't make any of those mistakes using warning colors. Things like our typography, so you can use the same fonts as us, and some of our design patterns that I've mentioned today. The file preview is up there, and forms is up there as well. Then, as you all know, we recently changed the cloud design from the server design. So we also have our server design guidelines documented up there for you as well. So that's design.atlassian.com/server. And for our server products, we also have a front-end library, which we call the Atlassian User Interface, which you can find at go/owie. And I've also linked our playbook up there if you're interested in learning more about how we design at Atlassian and how we collaborate on our design ideas, then I definitely think that's worth checking out. So, thank you for listening to me today. I hope you found that helpful. And Ralph, do we have any time for questions?
We